She was left for being too small until a giant Comanche built her a cabin. Dry Creek, New Mexico. Early spring, 1878. The sun had barely scraped the horizon when Clara Winn pushed open the door to the Dry Creek General Store. Her boots were scuffed, her hat a size too big, and the handles of a shortened hoe poked from the bundle on her back like broken wings. At 4 feet, 6.5 inches tall, she'd measured. Clara barely cleared the worn countertop, but her gaze was steady. Inside, the low murmur of voices died. A tall woman standing near the pickle barrels whispered, "She's no bigger than a house cat." "And half as useful," someone snorted from the shadows. Clara stepped forward, placing her items on the counter. A sack of corn seed, a folded square of canvas, a bundle of kindling, and the hoe with its custom shortened handle. Mr. Barlow, the storekeeper, peered over his spectacles, an eyebrow raised. "Well, well, if it ain't Miss Wynne, spring planting, is it?" He picked up the hoe, twirling it between two fingers. "You planning to dig graves for field mice or just burying sparrows for practice?" A wave of low laughter rolled through the room. Clara met his gaze. "I'm planting corn, on my land." Mr. Barlow grunted, weighing the sack in his hand. "That rocky patch north of town? Not even the cactus wants it." "Then I'll grow something they don't expect." He chuckled, thumping the hoe on the counter. "With this tool weighs half what you do." Clara opened her coin purse and counted out every last cent. "It'll do." She gathered the sack, the hoe, and what was left of her pride, and walked back into the morning light. The laughter followed her like dust devils, but she did not turn around. Outside, the air was grit and wind. As Clara crossed the wooden sidewalk, a shadow fell across her path. Thomas Keene. His hat was pulled low, his boots polished to a sheriff's shine. He was a Hargrove, from the same family that had taken her in as a charity case on the wagon train west, only to abandon her near the border when sickness came and she became too small a mouth to be worth feeding. "Well, look what crawled out of the dirt," Thomas drawled, folding his arms. "Little Clara Winn. Didn't we leave you behind somewhere?" She tried to step past him, but he blocked her way. "I heard you claimed land," he said, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Tell me, are you growing tumbleweeds or just trying to get eaten by coyotes?" "I have work to do," Clara muttered. Thomas reached out and yanked the sack from her grasp. The hoe clattered to the ground, and precious corn seeds spilled across the dusty boards. "Oops," he said, the word dripping with mock pity. Clara lunged for her things, but Thomas nudged her aside with the toe of his boot. "This ain't a place for dolls, Clara. You'll be dead or married to some outlaw before the first frost." He was still laughing when the air behind him shifted. A shadow rose from the ridge behind the store. Silent, broad, gray wolf. He didn't speak at first. He just stepped forward. A towering, lean figure with braided hair and a carved necklace resting against his bare chest. His eyes, dark and unmoving, fixed on the spilled seed. Thomas turned and froze. Gray Wolf stooped, lifted the hoe with one hand, and passed it back to Clara. Then he crouched, carefully scooping the corn back into the torn sack as if it were gold dust. When he was done, he stood, towering over them both. His voice was low, smooth as river gravel. "The earth does not care how small you are." Thomas took a reflexive step back. Gray Wolf turned to Clara and held out the sack. She took it, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't reply. He knelt once more, drew something from a pouch on his belt, and placed it gently at her feet. A single eagle feather, bound in a strip of leather. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the ridge, his steps silent on the gravel. Thomas stared after him, his jaw tight. Clara picked up the feather, her hand still trembling. She didn't look at Thomas again. She adjusted the sack, shouldered the hoe, and walked out of town, feet sore, heart pounding, but her spine straighter than when she had arrived. Behind her, the laughter was gone, and though she did not know his name, Clara felt a new weight against her ribs. Not just a feather, but the first proof that she was seen. And maybe, just maybe, believed in. The wind howled through the cottonwoods that clung to the edge of the arroyo. Clara Winn, all 4'6" of stubbornness, was wrestling a crooked fence post and losing. Her hands, calloused but small, gripped the shovel as she tried to carve a hole into the rocky soil. She had returned from town the day before with a cart of supplies: seeds, a rusted hoe, wire, and wood scraps from a dismantled coop. Her shelter, if one could call it that, was a lean-to of warped boards and canvas, pitched at the edge of her 20-acre claim. Each night, the wind clawed through the cracks, and she curled up under the tattered quilt her mother had stitched from dresses long gone, the last warmth of a family lost to fever in Missouri. "You're little, Clara," her mother used to say, tucking that same quilt around her. "But the wind lifts what it does not crush, and you, my girl, were made to fly." Now the wind only mocked her. Clara drove the shovel in again. It glanced off a stone with a thud that jarred her arms. She let out a frustrated breath and crouched, trying to pry the stone loose with her bare hands. As she tugged, something snapped inside her chest. Not pain, but a bitter, deep frustration. That night, it rained. A cold, steady desert rain that found every crack in her roof. She curled on her cot, water dripping onto the canvas beside her, fingers clenched around the quilt. She did not sleep. At dawn, she stepped outside, soaked and shivering, and she saw it. On the flat stone before her doorway sat a small wooden bird, no longer than her hand, carved in perfect detail. Its wings were slightly spread, its tail curved as if catching a breeze. It was smooth as river-polished bone, and burned into the base were 3 simple words: "I saw you." Clara's breath caught. She picked up the bird, holding it like something sacred. The wood was warm despite the morning chill. She looked toward the distant ridge, the one from which she always felt watched, but saw only mist curling off the rocks. She said nothing. She simply placed the bird safely inside her shelter and went back to work. 3 days later, the sky darkened again. Thunder rumbled in the foothills. Clara scrambled to reinforce the lean-to, climbing atop a crate to lash a corner of canvas tighter. The wind tore the fabric from her grip. As the rain began to fall, she lost her footing. The crate slid, and she tumbled hard into the mud. Dazed and gasping, she looked up and saw him. He stood in the rain like a shadow made flesh, tall, broad-shouldered, his black hair braided with strips of red leather. He moved with the silence of stone. Without a word, he stepped past her and seized the flapping tarp. In one fluid motion, he anchored it with rope, then reinforced the back wall with a stack of wood he seemed to produce from nowhere. Clara rose slowly, clutching her arm. "Why are you here?" He didn't answer at first. He turned, his eyes as dark as the storm, and met hers. You listen to the ground, he said at last, his voice deep and calm. You do not fight it. That is worth keeping. She blinked, rain running down her face. You carved the bird? He nodded once. It is called NNGQ. Tiet. Sparrow. Small, but it sings before the storm ends. She said nothing, just looked at this stranger who spoke like the wind and worked like a man possessed. She went inside her lean-to, returned with her canteen, and held it out. He hesitated, then took it, drank one measured sip, and handed it back with a nod. I am called Grey Wolf, he said. Oisida. She offered her name in return. Clara. Another nod, then he turned to go. Before he vanished into the rain, he paused. Build your roots deep, Clara Sparrow, he said, so they do not wash away. And then he was gone. But the storm no longer seemed so cruel. It had brought her something. Perhaps a beginning. The morning sun filtered through pale clouds as Clara struggled to drive another post into the earth. Her hands ached, her fingers raw despite the scraps of cloth she'd wrapped around them. The fence was barely waist-high, more symbolic than functional, but it marked her claim, her effort. That was when she heard the sound behind her. Not hooves, not boots. Softer. She turned to see Grey Wolf again, a bundle of trimmed pine logs on his shoulder as if they weighed nothing. He stopped just shy of her line of stakes and tilted his head. This, he said, is not strong. Clara set her jaw. It is what I can manage. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Together, better. He dropped the logs with a heavy thud and began to set the first one without waiting for permission. Clara hesitated, then grabbed her hammer. Side by side, they worked in a quiet rhythm. He drove stakes. She braced them. He cut rails. She measured the distance with her arms. By the time the sun was high, she was panting and covered in sawdust. You work too fast, she said between breaths. He didn't stop. You keep up. A short, breathless laugh escaped her. Barely. They paused under a cottonwood's sparse shade. She sat on a stump, sipping from her canteen. Grey Wolf crouched nearby, sharpening a hand axe with a river stone. I was taken once, he said suddenly. Clara blinked. Taken? He nodded. Mission school, far south. They cut my hair, gave me a number, said my tongue was wrong, my gods were wrong, my ways were wrong. She frowned. How old were you? 10 summers. He looked toward the ridge. I left after 2, escaped through a creek bed in winter, walked 4 days to find my people. Clara sat very still. That must have been terrifying. It was cold, he said simply. She studied his face, the quiet strength etched there. I never went to school. My father taught me to read before he died. After that it was just books and work. But people always looked at me and said I was too small, useless. Pretty little thing, they'd say. No good for farming, no good for a man. Just a waste of space. You are not, Grey Wolf said, without hesitation. Clara looked away, her voice dropping. Sometimes I believed them. He stood and walked to his pack. When he returned, he knelt before her. In his large hands, he held a pair of gloves made of soft, worn deerskin, stitched by hand. He placed them in her lap. Wood has splinters, he said. So does pride. Protect your hands. both kinds. She looked down at the gloves, then up at him. You made these? He nodded once. Thank you, she said, her voice tight with emotion. No one's ever given me anything like this. You earned it. You stay, you build. That is rare. They returned to work. The gloves fit perfectly. That afternoon, after the fence was finished, they stood looking over the land. Her garden patch, the lean-to, the fledgling fence line. Gray Wolf folded his arms. This will not last the winter. Clara's throat tightened. I know. He turned toward her. Let me build a cabin. She blinked. A what? He pointed toward the ridgeline. There is good pine. Strong. I can bring it down. Build real walls, a roof with weight. A home to survive, not just hide. Clara's heart thudded. You want to build me a house? He nodded. Yes. Gray Wolf, if people in town find out. I do not ask them, he said, his voice firm. I ask you. Their eyes met. His were steady, unreadable, but sincere. Clara swallowed hard. She looked at her lean-to, at her quilt drying on the line, her hands still cradling the gloves. A home, she whispered. She looked back at him. I'll think about it. He did not press her. I will come when the moon is new. If you say yes, I bring tools. Then he turned and walked toward the ridge, his footsteps as soft as mist on stone. But something had changed in the air. It was no longer just about survival. It was about possibility. The wind smelled of pine that morning, clean and sharp, carrying the faint echo of a hatchet striking wood. Clara wiped her brow and stepped back as Gray Wolf set another beam in place. The structure was rising, real walls, real angles, a cabin. He brought the logs himself, thick ponderosa pine, and showed her how to cut notches so they interlocked at the corners like fingers folded in prayer. No nails, he explained. Wood does not like metal. It holds its own weight, if cut right. Clara marveled at his precision. He worked with a silent certainty, as if speaking a language only the trees understood. She tried to keep up, measuring, sawing, dragging bark until her arms ached and her back screamed. Late that afternoon, Gray Wolf paused by the tallest post. He took out his knife and began to carve. Clara stepped closer and saw the shape emerging. A sparrow, wings tucked, eyes alert, carved right into the beam that would sit above the doorframe. For luck? She asked softly. He looked at her. So the roof knows who lives below it. Her throat caught. For me? He nodded. You are the sparrow. Small does not mean weak. A sparrow flies when others sink. She reached out, tracing the carving with her fingertips. Thank you. He stepped back and gestured toward the ridge. Tomorrow we raise the roof. But the roof would not come without trouble. The next day, while collecting water, Clara saw Amos Lang ride past the edge of her land. He didn't wave. He just stared, hard, then turned his horse and rode back toward Dry Creek. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. When she woke at dawn, she stepped outside to find something nailed to her old lean-to, a scrap of burlap scrawled in charcoal. No white girl who loves Injuns is welcome. She stared at it for a long time. Then she tore it down. Gray Wolf arrived soon after, a fresh beam across his shoulders. He saw her holding the note and stopped. She handed it to him. He read it, his expression unchanging. He walked to the fire pit, struck a match, and dropped the burlap into the flames. Wood does not ask skin color, he said, as smoke curled toward the sky. It only asks, whose hands built me? Clara looked at the half-framed cabin, the smooth pine, the bird carved into the beam. She looked at Grey Wolf. I want to finish it, she said. He nodded once. Then we do. They returned to work, hammering silence into strength. It was near midday when dust began to rise in the south, a bad omen curling over the mesquite. Clara stepped down from the porch beam she was sanding and shaded her eyes. 6 riders. At the front was Sheriff Beck, his badge gleaming, his mustache as stiff as a broom. Behind him were the Keene brothers, Amos Lang, and 3 other men whose faces were set in scowls. Grey Wolf stood by the woodpile, splitting logs with a quiet rhythm. He paused as the horses drew close, his axe still in hand, but lowered. Ms. Winn, Sheriff Beck called, stopping 10 paces from the cabin. We need a word. Clara walked to the edge of the clearing, her spine straight despite the pounding in her chest. What is it, Sheriff? He glanced at Grey Wolf, then back at her. Been a report of stolen horses from the Jenkins Ranch. 4 of them. Witnesses saw a tall Indian riding the southern trail. Matches this one's description. He's been here, Clara said calmly. Every day, building my home. Are you sure? Beck's eyes narrowed. You vouch for him? I do, she said. He's on my land. That cabin is being built on my claim. What he's done here, he's done with my permission. A murmur rippled through the men. Someone spat. Beck looked past her to Grey Wolf. Step away from the axe, son. We don't want trouble. Grey Wolf met his gaze, steady and unflinching, but he set the axe down slowly, deliberately. You got any proof he didn't take those horses? Beck asked Clara. You got any proof he did? She countered. Or is it enough that he's Comanche and breathing? Beck's jaw clenched. He's on private land, Sheriff, Clara continued. If you want him gone, Amos Lang sneered, his voice a low growl, you'll need a warrant. She's bewitched. Plain and simple. That savage has her building shrines to the devil himself. That savage, Clara snapped, her voice cutting through the tension, built me a home stronger than any man in this town ever offered. Silence settled like dust in the tense air. Then, the sound of hoofbeats echoed again. Another rider approached, older, refined, with silver hair swept back beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her posture was unmistakable, even on horseback. It was Matilda Everdeen, the most respected woman in Dry Creek, widow of the town's founder. Her word could calm a riot, or start one. She pulled up beside the sheriff and dismounted with a grace that defied her years. John, she said, nodding to the sheriff. Gentlemen. They all mumbled greetings, their certainty wavering under her steady gaze. Before we start slinging accusations, Mrs. Everdeen said crisply, perhaps I should clarify something. She pulled a folded paper from her satchel. This morning, the Jenkins Ranch recovered all 4 of their missing horses. They'd broken loose during the last thunderstorm, found them grazing by Willow Gulch. No signs of theft whatsoever. Sheriff Beck reached for the paper, a frown creasing his brow as he read. Then what in the hell is this all about? Amos growled, his face reddening. Mrs. Everdeen turned her sharp, intelligent eyes on him. This is about fear, Mr. Lang, and how quicken men forget themselves when they are faced with something new. She turned to Clara, her voice softening. You built this home with your own hands? Not alone, Clara said, glancing toward Grey Wolf. But I helped. Matilda surveyed the sturdy, half-finished cabin, then looked back at the sheriff. Well then, she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. I see no crime here. Just construction. Beck sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You sure about this, Matilda? As sure as I was when your mother gave me her wedding ring and said, "Trust the girl who dares to stand alone." The sheriff cleared his throat. All right then, we'll be on our way. He turned, muttering orders, and the posse wheeled their horses around. Before leaving, Beck gave Grey Wolf a long, hard look. You stay clean, son. Grey Wolf did not reply. He did not need to. Once the dust settled, Clara stood frozen, her breath shallow. Her knees trembled with the aftermath of the confrontation. Grey Wolf stepped forward. He said nothing, but laid his large hand gently on her shoulder. Not to claim, not to warn, but simply to steady her. The warmth of his touch sank deep, anchoring her to the ground. She closed her eyes and let it hold her. The next morning, Clara woke to an unfamiliar sound. Voices. Multiple voices, not arguing or shouting, but flowing together in a current of shared purpose. She threw off her blanket and stepped from beneath her makeshift canvas shelter, her boots sinking into the damp earth. And then she froze. Half a dozen wagons were lined up along the rise above her home, their wheels caked with red dust. Men and women were climbing down, carrying baskets, planks, and tools. Children scampered behind them, their curiosity a bright spark in the morning chill. Leading them all was Matilda Everdeen, her boots defiant against the slope of the land. "Good morning, Ms. Winn," she called out, her voice as firm as the ground beneath them. "We have a house to finish, do we not?" Clara stood speechless. Behind her, Grey Wolf emerged from the half-built doorway, axe still resting across his back. His dark eyes scanned the unexpected visitors, his posture a silent question. Matilda approached the cabin's edge. "These folks," she said, gesturing with a gloved hand, "are not here to gawk or gossip. They are here to help." First came the Millers, placing a worn but lovingly kept rocking chair on the porch and a small black cook stove beside the entryway. The Cooper brothers followed, their wagons stacked with window glass and hinges. The Williams family brought jars of preserves, smoked meat, and a heavy wool quilt that Clara instantly recognized as hand-stitched. More came, offering wood, nails, shingles, food, even a sack of coffee beans wrapped in brown paper. One by one, the settlers of Dry Creek offered what they could. Some gave their labor, others their goods. All of them gave a nod of quiet recognition, an unspoken understanding that something important was happening here. Clara's throat tightened. She had prepared herself to be an outcast, to be whispered about behind turned backs. She had not prepared for kindness. She glanced at Grey Wolf. His face remained a mask of calm, but his stance had softened, his hands unclenching at his sides. And then they began, all morning. The valley echoed with the sound of hammers and quiet conversation. Clara moved among them, a part of the rhythm, carrying shingles to the roof and smoothing mud between the logs. Grey Wolf worked alongside the Cooper brothers, hoisting beams with a silent strength that drew hushed respect. He carved joints and cut notches with an artist's precision, his presence no longer a source of suspicion, but the very anchor of the work. By late afternoon, the house was finished. Sunlight streamed through the new glass windows, casting ribbons of gold across the swept floor. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney of the newly fitted stove. The door hung straight and true. Clara stood in the center of it all, not a cabin, but a home, and slowly turned, taking it all in. She heard footsteps and turned to see Grey Wolf in the doorway. He held a small bundle wrapped in soft, aged doeskin. "For you," he said simply. She untied the leather cord and folded back the cloth. Inside lay a silver bracelet, a single stone of turquoise, worn smooth by time and touch, was set in its center. Etched into the metal were small, delicate symbols, clouds, wind, and a single bird in flight. It shimmered not with wealth, but with history. "It was my wife's," Grey Wolf said, his voice low and reverent. "She wore it until the fever came." Clara's fingers faltered. I can't take this. It's too precious." "You do not take it," he replied, his gaze meeting hers. "It finds you. It has chosen you." Her chest swelled with something that felt like breathing after years of holding her breath. Slowly, she slipped the bracelet over her wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. As the sun dipped toward the hills, the neighbors began to pack their wagons, leaving behind gifts, handshakes, and quiet promises to visit again. Mrs. Everdeen was the last to leave. "You've made something real here," she said, her eyes on Clara. Then she turned to Grey Wolf. "And you've kept your promise." He bowed his head slightly, a gesture filled with more meaning than any words. When silence finally returned to the foothills, Clara sat on her new porch step. The silver bracelet caught the last rays of light. Beside her, Grey Wolf watched the sun descend. For the first time since she'd arrived in this harsh, unforgiving land, Clara Winn did not wonder where else she could go. She was already home. The full moon set, and dawn's pale light crept across the hills. Grey Wolf stood before the cabin, the morning air still and expectant. "I must go," he said, his voice soft but steady. "The council must know who you are. In 7 days, if you still wear this bracelet, our new life begins." Clara swallowed against the hope rising in her throat. She touched the turquoise on her wrist. "I will wear it," she promised, her voice calm, though her heart trembled. "I will be here." He dipped his head in gratitude, his dark eyes holding hers for a long moment. Then he mounted his horse, turned once more to face her, and rode north into the rising sun. A profound silence fell over the cabin, an absence that echoed louder than any sound. Clara stepped inside, touching the doorframe where his hand had rested. It still felt warm. 7 days later, he returned, just as he had promised. That same morning, after their quiet reunion, Clara walked into Dry Creek and sought out Reverend Miller at the small white church. Sunlight slanted through the stained glass windows, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air. "Reverend," she began, "I need your help." He looked up from his desk, his spectacles perched on his nose. "Miss Wynne, what troubles you?" She took a breath. "Grey Wolf and I, we wish to be married." His face grew stern. He removed his glasses and sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Clara, I cannot officiate this. It is unconventional. The parish would be scandalized. My duty is to our traditions." Tears pricked her eyes, but she held them back. "I understand." She bowed her head and left, her dignity a fragile shield against the ache in her chest. Outside, she found Mrs. Everdeen sweeping the porch of the general store. The older woman looked up, her eyes knowing and kind. "Mrs. Everdeen," Clara said, her voice hesitant. "Grey Wolf and I are to be married." The Reverend refused. "I was hoping, perhaps you—" Matilda set aside her broom. "Child," she said, her voice firm, "I have helped build more than one frontier town. If the church will not stand for love, then I will." Clara blinked, astonished. "You would?" The old woman smiled. "I saw that bracelet on your wrist the moment you came seeking help. Your choice was made 7 days ago. Of course I'll stand with you." Gratitude washed over Clara, warm and overwhelming. "Thank you." On the day of their wedding, they climbed the rocky slope behind the cabin. There, on a flat rock high above the foothills, Grey Wolf knelt and opened a small leather pouch. It was a Comanche ceremony, he explained. He painted 2 lines on her cheek: red clay for life, black soot for protection, and then did the same for himself. They exchanged simple necklaces braided from sinew and bone. He spoke his vows in a language that felt as ancient as the wind, promises of walking together, of honoring the earth, the sky, and each other. Clara repeated his words, her voice awkward but earnest. Finally, he raised his arm to the open sky. "Let all spirits bear witness." They touched foreheads, a quiet vow exchanged under the vast, attentive sky. At noon, they walked arm in arm into Dry Creek. A hush fell over the town as they passed. Some watched from behind curtains, but others nodded in quiet respect. Mrs. Everdeen waited for them home, where wildflowers filled the room. She stood before a small wooden lectern and read from a worn book, not of scripture, but of territorial law. She spoke of acceptance, of partnership, and of courage. When she was finished, she took both their hands in hers. "By the covenant of truth, bravery, and love," she declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Dusk found them back on their porch. The last light of day pulsed across the new glass windows. The scent of pine and rich earth filled the cooling air. Clara leaned against him, her silver bracelet a pale gleam against his dark coat. She whispered, "I was always told I was too small for this world, but now I have a home, built by someone who sees strength in that smallness." Grey Wolf turned to face her, moonlight catching in his dark eyes. He brushed a finger across the bracelet's turquoise stone. "You showed your worth, stone by stone, choice by choice. You are not small. You are my equal, my family." A deep and knowing silence settled between them, broken only by the rustle of pine needles and the distant call of an owl. Their future was uncertain. Storms would come and whispers would rise. But in that moment, in the shelter of their own making, they rested. 2 souls bound by earth and sky, by love and by grit. They had chosen each other, without apology and without regret, as the world spun patiently onward into the night. If this story stirred something deep within you, if it reminded you that even the smallest among us can carry the greatest strength, then you've just touched the heart of what we do here. At Wild West Love Stories, we bring you tales of impossible love, fierce resilience, and the quiet moments that change everything. Stories where honor lives in calloused hands and love defies the rules of the frontier. So if Clara and Grey Wolf's journey meant something to you, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button, join our growing community, and saddle up for the next unforgettable ride. Because out here in the Wild West, true love may be rare, but when it comes, it builds something that even time cannot tear down.